Well, good evening. I hope that we're recording here. I know we're recording. I hope that the video is on. I'm having problems as I usually do. I apologize for that. I'm about 12 minutes late. But we are here tonight to go over our last two chapters. Chapter 16, Organizational Goals and Structures, then followed by Chapter 17, Strategy, Technology, and Organizational Design. So let's look at the study questions for Chapter 16. What are the different types of organizational goals? What are the hierarchical aspects of organizations? How is work organized and coordinated? And finally, what are bureaucracies and what are the common forms of bureaucracies? Well, this particular slide, societal goals, simply as it says, reflects the organization's intended contributions. And when it does that, when it reflects the organization's intended contributions, it allows the organization to make what says here on the slide legitimate claims over some resources to use to make product or provide services, etc. Obviously, and then it goes on a little bit further with individuals, markets, etc. And this particular slide gives us some kind of mission statement examples. I just need to stop here a second and make sure we're on the, we need to go back one slide, I believe. Here we go. Mission statement. And then we're going to get to, I skipped a slide, I'm sorry about that. We're going to get to what Aflac and Harley Davidson have to say. This is the statement of our purpose. It is, we say, the reason we're in business. And it tells a good mission statement is short and concise. And not only does it say what business we're in and how we're going to do it, but how we're going to accomplish our goals and objectives. So let's look at a couple here. Aflac, as you probably can best associate with the duck. And then Harley Davidson. Look at Harley. I'm not going to talk too much about Aflac's, but look at Harley Davidson's. We fulfill dreams through the experience of motorcycling. And so it's not giving you any frills. It talks about an experience for somebody who owns a motorcycle and what's going to happen for them. By providing to motorcyclists and the general public, an expanding line of motorcycles and branded products and services in selected market segments. So it's telling you, this is what we're going to do. We're going to fulfill the dreams of motorcyclists, be out in the open air. By the way, I used to live on what I would call a country road, although the building on the road no longer makes it country. My wife, I lived there for about 10 years. I remember it as a young boy, and when I first started to drive, you could drive out that way, and you wouldn't see 20 automobiles running the whole length of the country road. But the motorcyclists loved it because it did bends and turns and had a few elevations, not severe, and downs and things of that nature. On the weekend, we used to see motorcyclists all the time. Now they're rebuilding that road, and I don't know how much it's going to be able to do that. But Harley Davidson says this is what we're into. This is what we do. They don't talk about anything else. And they also say in selected market segments. So they're telling you that they're limiting their market segment. They're not there for everybody. They're there for the motorcycle enthusiast. And they're maybe going to try to attract some of the general public. The next slide talks about output goals. And that simply defines the type of business that we're in. As the slide says, I can't clean that up any. And then it gives a little more pizzazz, if you will, to the general mission statement. So this says substance. Maybe that's a better word than saying pizzazz. Pizzazz talks about wow and gee whiz and a few other things. So that's probably not right. But it talks about the nuts and bolts as opposed to mission statement. Mission statement should be an overarching statement, kind of like the Harley-Davidson statement. And then we get to these output goals, and it gives us some kind of roadmap in a way of what we're going to do and how we're going to get there. Systems goals, on the other hand, are a little bit different. They're concerned with what we do within the organization. Because if we don't have those in place, and then how we intend to run our systems, we're going to run into problems of long-term survival and long-term success. And notice what they include: productivity, stability, flexibility, prestige, and things of that nature. So it is important that we see these systems goals, and those are internal. That's what makes us up, what makes us who we are, etc. Now, this is what well-designed systems goals can do for us. Notice the first one: they focus the attention of managers on the tasks at hand. They do allow for flexibility, and I think that's something we need to think about. Sometimes we think of operational things being rather rigid. Operational goals, systems goals should have some parameters, but then allow a flexibility within those parameters to be able to get the job done. Notice down here: balance constraints and opportunities, and then form a basis for dividing the work within the firm. I like to think of that as more of an operational goal, but operations comes within systems. Now, this next slide talks about formal structure. All organizations have to have formal structure. They have it through things like job descriptions and things of that nature, which spell out job duties and responsibilities, and many times the equipment to be used, whether it's machinery or what happens to be. And notice it talks about the configuration of positions, and the word it adds before that is planned. So there's some planning in it. So let's go back to the managerial functions we talked about in chapter 1. Planning is number one, and it has to be number one because without a plan, you can't do the other type things. And then, of course, the other thing it talks about, especially when you get into formal structure, is lines of authority and things of that nature. Vertical specialization. I don't think there's too much we really have to talk about here. Vertical is hierarchical. It's an up and down type thing as opposed to horizontal. And it talks about how we structure the organization, how it goes, etc. And there are lines of authority and lines of demarcation set up within this vertical specialization. Now, this particular slide just talks about an organizational chart. When I was in the Army, we called them wiring diagrams. Doesn't make too much difference what you want to do, but it shows the formal reporting relationships within an organization, and it also will show the positions, show the position holders. Now, sometimes a company will attach a name to that position. Pardon me, sometimes they won't. And then, of course, as you see here on the slide, and we're going to get to one here in just a second, a typical one, it gives the lines of authority. And we're going there next. And this is figure 16.1, which you can see at the bottom of page 377 in the text. Now this gives a chart, organizational chart, as it knows, as it mentions here, for a state university. And so what we have here, we show line and staff relationships, and then staff relationships. And so we show the president, and underneath the president, he has vice president for academic affairs, and then vice president for administration. Then you notice the staff relationships that come off from the president, the assistant for finance, programs, personnel, etc. And then we have some other line relationships, treasurer, physical plant, etc., etc. And you'll notice that the staff relationships report back to the president, and they do not report back to the vice presidents of academic affairs, et cetera, et cetera. These folks report back to the president. Whereas underneath the vice president of administration and vice president of academic affairs, we have certain things, and notice where they come in particular areas, et cetera. And then that's just how that is set up. Also, you will notice that the president has some direct responsibility with the college deans, although that stems from and through the vice president of academic affairs. Span of control is a very simple thing to think about. This is simply the number of people that report to one manager or one supervisor. I've mentioned a number of times in this course when I was in the Army, we used a number of 10. I'm not saying 10's the right number or the wrong number, but it is an easy number to use. And notice that what the second part of the slide says, the second bullet, it talks about with the advent of increased communications within organizations through the use of computers and social media, pardon me, and things of that nature. We have flatter organizations. We've talked about this before. And because we have flatter organizations, there's a broader span of control. One of the things we have to remember, and I have mentioned it in the course before, but it does bear repeating. One of the reasons we had managers for so many managers for so many years was to impart information. We didn't have this ability to almost instantly communicate with every employee that works for us. And so that's why we had the number of managers we have now. When we've taken those managers out, because we can communicate more efficiently, I'm staying away from the word effectively, but certainly more efficiently, then we can eliminate layers of bureaucracy, which we're going to get to a little bit later, and then talk about span of control being expanded because we don't need that number of managers any longer. We have discussed this before, and it bears repeating. We have the difference between line units and staff units. Line units are the folks that do the production. They do many things. Notice it also mentions here in one thing marketing departments. These people do functions that directly have to do with the production or the movement, if you will, of the production out to the buying public. Whereas staff units are folks that are specialized, and you usually find them in accounting and finance and human resources, and maybe some other type areas. And they use their specialized expertise to advise, stress on the word advise, the line units. They do not control the line units. And many times you have this yin and yang, if you will, of the line units asking the staff units for advice and expertise, and it's given to them, and they don't pay attention to it, do what they want, and that causes some aggravation with the staff units. Now, a typical one, as far as I'm concerned, is information management. Maybe you prefer information technology. And many times what happens is we have a disconnect, because someone like me will say to the information technology folks, please show me how to do something so I can do this for my students, for my course, for whatever it happens to be. And so instead of showing me what to do, they'll try to tell me how to build a watch. And I'm uninterested in that. I'm interested in knowing how to use the technology to deliver what I want to do, but I don't want to know the technical aspects. I just want to know the things that are going to keep me out of trouble. So if that doesn't happen, then I'm going to have a problem. Now, control here, we're going to talk about this. This is, again, remember, this is one of the 4 functions of managements, of managers, or managerial functions, a better way to say that. And this is what we do when we set up parameters, actions, it says here, that keep our output within predetermined limits. So we've already said, okay, pardon me, here's how it's better to do it this way. Here's our tolerance. And everything that is within this tolerance level, say this is high, this was low, everything that fits within those parameters is okay. We can ship this product. Now, we might like to have it a little closer to the high end, but as long as it's within this area, we're going to say it's okay. So what we're going to do when we have this control operation, we're going to set standards. Then we're going to measure our production against set standards. And when we find out that something is outside of tolerance, now we're going to adjust what we have to do. Now, the way that you want to do this is you want this control, whatever measurements you have, to go through the entire production run. So you're measuring all along the way to make sure things are staying within spec or within tolerance, whatever the word you want to use is. And you're making adjustments as you go along, as opposed to waiting to the end. I know I've mentioned this before and say, oh, well, this product's defective and I'll throw it out. That hasn't solved anything. All I've done is produce a defective product. I may not know what caused it to be defective, and I've increased scrap. So this control mechanism has to be instituted throughout the production process. And so we can measure what we're doing right along and make adjustments as we need to make them, and not wait till the final end. Output controls, fairly interesting. I think this is what we do. We are trying to stay within target, within standards. And however, and this is a very big however, we set them up in such a way that allows managers to adjust what they're doing to make sure they're going to stay within the defined targets. So if the managers decide they need to increase production or decrease production, or they need to shift resources or whatever, they're allowed to do that, and they have that flexibility as long as they stay within the predetermined targets that we've set up. And then notice the last part is, part of this is doing what we call managing by exception. We're not going to make any changes unless changes are necessary. And then once they're necessary, we're going to do that. Now, you have process controls. And these tell us what we have to do, how we have to do it, and in what manner things are supposed to be accomplished. And within these overall process controls, we have things like policies and procedures, rules, standardization, etc. And then we have this thing called total quality management controls. And we'll get to total quality management a little bit later here. In this particular slide, we're going to talk about two things: policies and procedures. Policies give us some kind of an idea. They outline objectives. They're broad, and they indicate in some respect how we're supposed to do a specific task or a number of tasks. A procedure, on the other hand, describes the best way to do that. And it also tells us which parts of what we're doing, which part of the task whole is important. And we need to pay attention to those that are more important than others. Then we go from policies and procedures to rules. And it's pretty simple here. A rule tells us what can be done and what can't be done. And maybe I should change that around and say what should not be done. And so if we're doing this within a task here, as the slide says, it gives us a series of steps to follow. And then it also tells us you can't do this, or you can't do that, or you can't do something else. And I remember when I was in the Army, we were changing some training methods. So one of the things that they were doing, the training gurus, were trying to show that you need to do things in certain steps. And it used to aggravate a lot of soldiers because they wanted to go right through because they knew how to do all the shortcuts. Not realizing that a new soldier didn't know the shortcuts, and if he learned the shortcuts or she learned the shortcuts the wrong way, they were liable to do some damage. So it caused a lot of angst, and eventually I think we got ourselves through that. Now there's two concepts we want to talk here about, formalization and standardization. And I want to probably read the slides a little bit more than I normally would because we tend to exchange these two words frequently, and they shouldn't be exchanged. Formalization is written documentation, rules, policies, procedures, etc. Standardization, on the other hand, is the degree to which the range of allowable actions in the job or series of jobs is limited, so that as it goes on, actions are performed in a uniform manner. So remember that formalization talks about written rules and procedures, etc., whereas standardization says you've got to do it this way. So a little bit different. And I want you to try to take that aspect and see how that works for you. Now we're going to talk about total quality management, a concept, I guess you want to say, although it's something that we talk about today, and this talks about controls. It was a concept developed by a statistician by the name of W. Edwards Deming. Dr. Deming was on this is the old story. Was on General MacArthur's staff after Japan surrendered, and the United States was occupying Japan, and MacArthur was the supreme commander, if you will, in occupied Japan. Well, the story goes is that Deming made a pest of himself. I don't know whether this is true or not, by the way. Deming made a pest of himself, and then to get him away from folks who were who were being aggravated, and MacArthur sent him over to the Japanese, and he taught the Japanese the principles of total quality management, and they took that and came over here in the late 50s and 60s and started beating our brains out. So total quality management now has been, I want to say here, this has been superseded in some areas of production management and control in the United States by things like Six Sigma, zero defects, and a few other type things. But notice that this is a process approach using the control function to improve production. And not only improve production, but improve the way we wind up producing things. Now, Dr. Deming, he had 14 points, and you can see them on page 383 in your text, figure 6.2. I'm not going to read these, and by the way, we don't have them captured on PowerPoint slides here. But some of the things that Deming say I think we need to think about. One is institute modern on-the-job training. Another is to, and I think a very serious one, and you should pick up on this, as we talked about this a little bit in chapter 11, although not the same way, break down barriers between departments. And then another one he talked about, which is what Six Sigma does, and that's require statistical evidence of process control and eliminate financial controls on production. So Dr. Deming was sort of ahead of his time, and many of his concepts and principles are still used today, although, as I said, we find some other methods in our Six Sigma, which is used by General Electric Corporation, and there's some other ones around. But what it really did was it caused organizations to focus on their quality and have some measurement of understanding quality and looking at this through the entire production run, and not just saying, oh, we're going to look at this at the end of the production run. So he wanted to institute quality throughout the production run and move it in that fashion. A lot of people don't like Deming's work for a raft of reasons. I think none of them probably very good. And I'm not saying that you have to adopt what Deming did, what his principles, but I do think that you should look at that and take some of that home with you. Perhaps you want to look at Six Sigma and a few other things. By the way, Six Sigma, to anybody who does Six Sigma, has to be trained to do that, et cetera, et cetera. Now we have two things we talk about here on this particular slide. Centralization, we know what that means, and they're talking here about decisions, and decisions are reserved for those folks in the corner offices. Decentralization, think of this as empowerment, where the authority to make decisions is pushed to the lowest level possible. And what I mean by that is it's pushed to the level at where it has the greater impact. So if you're able to do that, that's what this is empowerment. This is bringing people into the decision-making process and giving them responsibility and authority that they may not have had previously. Of course, as I've mentioned before, if you're going to do that, you have to certainly stand behind the person that you're giving this, newfound authority to. Well, we have to have some benefits of decentralization. We believe, or at least people who have done some empirical research studies on this, believes that decentralization leads to higher employee satisfaction. we tend to see quicker responses because people at the place where the rubber meets the road have the opportunity to make decisions. And there is some assistance and on-the-job training helps them for people moving up to higher level positions. And finally, decentralization is a popular approach today in many organizations, especially in the computer-related industry. We see probably more decentralization there than we see anyplace else. Now we're going to talk here about some things that we've kind of touched on before, and that's things like departmentalization and things of that nature. This aspect is simply grouping people together by expertise. Notice here examples on the slide talk about finance, accounting, and a few other type things. This is, as it says here, the popular form of horizontal specialization. The next slide, which is figure 16.3, and you can see this on top of page 386, gives some advantages and some disadvantages to departmentalization. And I'm not going to go through all of these. You may look at this at your leisure, but I want to focus on a couple of the disadvantages and talk about that. And I think that we have to be careful about this, because when we do this, we may wind up with narrowly defined jobs that may lend themselves to routine, mundane tasks. And we know that's can be a recipe for disaster. Then communications is difficult, and individuals, the last one, may look to higher level folks for direction and reinforcement rather than focus attention on products, services, and clients. So there's some pluses here, but there's some minuses, and you have to look at those and decide which is best that you want to do. We're going to talk about divisions and a couple other things here in a second. But you have to understand that almost anything that you do in this division of labor has pluses and minuses, and you have to determine for yourself which is best to implement. Divisional departments, as you can see here, tend to be grouped around products. It can be territories, it can be clients, it could be a number of type things. So again, we have some form of specialization here, and we need to think about that. And this next slide, which is figure 16.4, which is on the next page, the 387, gives us some kind of a wiring diagram here, hierarchical reporting relationships, where we have the president and CEO at the top, and over the left we have automotive parts, international division, financial services, etc. And we need to, again, look at what we have here, advantages and disadvantages. And again, I like to focus a little bit on disadvantages as opposed to advantages, because I think those are the things we have to think about more often than the advantages. A lot of times we see advantages and we say, okay, well, let's jump into this thing because it's given us economies of scale and everything else, when in fact we need to look at the overall perspective and determine whether or not we're getting our bang for our buck. It can create conflict between divisions in fighting over scarce resources. It may give a priority to divisional goods over the health and welfare of the organization. In other words, what happens here is we're becoming insular, and we're saying, this is what we do and this is what we're about. And we're not thinking about what the organization's about and how we fit into the organization. So what we're saying here in essence is the tail is wagging the dog. No, we can't do that. That's just not something that's kosher, not something to be accepted, not something to be tolerated. The next one we have is the matrix organization, matrix departmentalization, and that brings both a functional and divisional forms into one. Now remember, one of the things of the matrix organization, and I'm getting here to disadvantages, is the fact that you have lost the chain of command. You're bringing people in from one place, and he or she still has the boss over this in this other area. And so we're bringing people in, but they have two bosses in a way. And so there's some confusion about using too many words there, about what my job really is. Because I still have this job and I still have this other office I belong to, whether it's department or division is irrelevant. And I don't have a total release from those folks. And so I have this conundrum going on here in my mind. It is expensive to operate. And lastly, and perhaps most important, it's difficult to explain. People just don't understand it very well. And how can I be here and I still belong to somebody else? I had an opportunity when I was assigned to St. Louis when I was in the Army, personnel command out there. And we were going through some changes, and I was assigned to a task force, and this was a matrix thing. I still had my regular office, I still had my regular boss, but I met with these people on a daily basis, and we batted things around, et cetera, et cetera. Now, those of us within the organization there where we were meeting got along very well. There was no problem with that. But we felt in many cases what we were recommending was not being taken seriously. But again, we thought in many cases, well, here we are. We're just here to do something, and whatever we're doing isn't going to be implemented. And yet we still had the other job back at wherever it happened to be that we're responsible for. So it has some problems. Coordination, I don't think we need to talk a lot about that. It talks about a set of mechanisms, and I guess if you want to think about organizations do have mechanisms, but I don't think most of us think a lot about that. We do think a lot about it when somebody raises a barrier and says, well, you have to go through these hoops before you can talk to us, before you can coordinate with us. That's when we think about that there are mechanisms in place. But we see those as barriers. We don't see those as gates to walk through. And even though it talks about what organizations do, like actions and units in a consistent pattern, and that may well be true. My experience is, and I have to talk about my experience. My experience is that we normally take this when we see these mechanisms that are talked about as barriers, not as gates. Personal methods of coordination. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this. It talks about, just getting together with other people and doing this thing. And there's a lot of things that goes on here. But what this is doing is that if companies can foster this personal coordination, in other words, giving somebody carte blanche to coordinate his or her efforts with somebody else, that it looks like that would be a good relationship. That coordination needs to be handled and carried forward. That would be something that would really be beneficial to them. Impersonal methods. I guess the thing I want to say here is when you talk about impersonal, you take away, or at least to me, you take away this business of, immediate interaction. And there's some standoffish to it. It doesn't feel real. So we have to be careful about that. This is really talking about things like email and text messages and things of that nature. And you have to be careful when you do that, because you want people, when they're coordinating with others, and to have some sense of ownership. And if you're doing it impersonally, that can't be avoided many times, and sometimes that's the best way to do it, but that sense of ownership is missing. And so you really have to make sure what you're doing is going to pay you dividends before you decide you want to go on this impersonal method. We now come to, I think I skipped a slide here. We now come to a favorite or not so favorite topic of many people, and that is bureaucracy. Now, most of us look at bureaucracy as built on red tape, built on we can't do that, built on our rules say that's not possible, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not how bureaucracy was started. It started by a gentleman by the name of, or came up with the concept by the name of Max Weber. By the way, that's spelled W-E-B-E-R. He was a German sociologist, among other things. And what he said was that bureaucracy was built on merit in a way, that we talked about. It was logical. There was some lines of authority. There were clear demarcation of what this branch of people did versus what that branch of people did, and there were rules, and people followed the rules. Pardon me. Most of the time, bureaucracies really tell you, in some cases when they're set up that way, things that you cannot do. But they don't tell you sometimes things that you can do. So what we tend to think about is that bureaucracies are very rigid. And in some manner of speaking, they're not completely rigid, but they can be. It's when people just become very dictatorial and work to the rule and don't work to the intent of trying to assist people in doing things and getting along, et cetera, et cetera. Mechanistic, pretty simple here. It follows vertical lines of authority. And organic talks about, and it's mentioned here in your textbook, it's seen to be progressive bureaucracy, talks about horizontal specialization. And these are the benefits of the organic. By the way, there probably are some benefits of mechanistic. We have to think about sometimes you do need command and control, and that may be what you have to have as opposed to this. But the benefits here of the organic is better, as it mentions here, better problem solving and serving individual customers, as opposed to being, a rule bound, which we think about bureaucracies. The centralization is not as pervasive in this type of bureaucracy, and because it's a little more nimble, because it's not stultified by too many rules, is able, or actually I should say the people within this type of bureaucracy are more adaptable, they're more nimble, and they're more able to detect problems and address those as quickly as possible. And then finally, we come to what are known as hybrid bureaucracies, a divisional firm composed of, as I said, quasi-independent divisions, so that the different divisions can be more or less organic or mechanistic as is necessary. And finally, a conglomerate, which is and I want to read this to you because it's a little bit different than what we normally think. A single corporation that contains a number of unrelated businesses. And we think of conglomerates in some other aspects, but this is what it is actually saying. Well, that brings us to the end of chapter 16. It is 5:28. We spent the last about 45 minutes discussing chapter 16, organizational goals and structures. So we'll take a 5-minute break. I'm gonna err on the side of where we are. Come back at 5:34, and we'll get into chapter 17. Please come back at 5:34. Thank you. Well, it's 5:34. We're back. We're into our last chapter, chapter 17, strategy, technology, and organizational design, and the sub-bullet, how to compete in a changing landscape. And I think that's something we really need to keep in mind, that business today and operations today of businesses are constantly evolving. We're in a global marketplace. I know that each of you have heard that before and probably have heard it more often than what you want to hear. But it is true that we're there. We have to think about that. We have to think about operations in that manner. And so we have to know that it's changing. We have some new players in the street. Certainly China's around. India is becoming more of a force, and we're going to find more and more of that. And Americans are going to have to be nimble and adaptable and being able to change and meet the challenges of the workplace in which we find ourselves. So the study questions that we want to look for, and we hope we can, in some aspect, answer as we go through this next 50 or so minutes. What are strategy and organizational, why are strategy and organizational learning important? What is organizational design and how is it linked to strategy? Pardon me, how does technology influence organizational design? How does the environment influence organizational design? And then how should the whole organization be led strategically? Very important questions. And I don't think as we go through this chapter, we're going to be able to have definitive answers for all these things, but hopefully we can move in the direction that'll point you in some aspects so we get a good, at least a grounding on this, and then we can move into other areas, places, look at researchers that have done more work. Strategy is simply putting the organization in a position to be competitive in the field in which it operates. And then obviously the latter part of that bullet says we have to implement the planning actions that we have developed if we expect long-term success. Strategy, as the slide says, there is not something that is done today and it's going to last forever. Strategy is ever evolving. And notice the next thing. Strategic planning should involve individuals at every level within the organization. Now, everybody doesn't do the same type thing. If we go back to chapter 1, we know that folks in the corner offices have to have different type skills than those folks that are in the middle level and the folks are where the rubber meets the road. But you have to have all people because it's important to get the input from people who are actually physically doing the job. Is this possible? Now, I'll give you an example of that. Toyota has a policy that when they're going to bring out a new model or make some radical change to a model, they bring their suppliers in and say to their suppliers, this is what we want to do. Can you accommodate us? Isn't that a novel approach? We really shouldn't think that it is. You know, if you're going to develop a strategy and you don't have the strategic partners in bed with you on your strategy, it isn't going to work. You need resources, you need materials, you need other things to do what you want to make it do. And if those people don't know what you're going to do, they have no way to plan to do the things that they need to do to support what it is that you want to do. So, you know, it's a symbiotic relationship. Strategy is co-evolving process. We mentioned that before. And it's a pattern of decisions. In some places, it's the overarching strategy. Some places, it's the technical piece of strategy. You know, what am I going to do here? What is it that I have to do? So we have to think about those things and how do I fit into the overall strategic operation? How does my part figure into this? This is one of the keys, and I honestly don't like this term. It's called organizational learning. Organizations themselves don't learn, but the people who work in them learn. So what this is really saying to me, and I think it should say to you, is that organizations should promote an atmosphere of learning, of challenging people, to having people to think outside their comfort zones, and to think about what they could do, changes they could make, et cetera, et cetera. Now, notice what it says here. This is the process of bringing information in, and then to fit that information so it's useful to people and can help the company's long-term survival and long-term success. Notice here what the three things it says here. You have to be able to distribute the information. The information has to be interpreted. There has to be meaning given to it. I like to say before you do anything with it, when you brought it in, it's just a bunch of raw data. And until somebody makes some sense out of it. Not to say that what you get doesn't make sense, but until it makes sense for you, it's meaningless. And then you have to be able to store that information someplace so that you can retrieve it when necessary. This slide, mimicry, just talks about looking for solutions and maybe going out and finding out what other people have done and how they've handled their situations that are similar to yours. And don't reinvent the wheel. You know, it's copying, mimicry, is the highest form of compliment. If you find somebody does something well and you do it, you're complimenting a person. Say, hey, you know, you guys did well, and I learned from what you did well, and found out I didn't have to do something over again. Just copied what you did. I made it fit my circumstances. Notice the last thing here. It helps us establish legitimacy. So people understand it. And you say, you know, we borrowed this idea from so-and-so. There's no, we don't have to worry about this. We don't have to worry about pride of ownership. If it works, it works. And we don't have to worry about who gets credit for this. Vicarious learning is interesting because it gives us something we don't normally think about. That's simply learning from other people's experiences. We learn through what they did. Kind of goes back to mimicry in a way, but it's a little bit different. Now, there's some things we can also do here in this, promoting this organizational learning. One is scanning, pardon me. The other is grafting. Scanning, we looking to the outside, finding things that we like that we believe will work for us, and bringing them back and then discarding the other. We're only going to take what's going to be helpful to us. And then grafting is just getting in, talks about getting individuals and bringing them into the firm, if you will, because they have expertise or knowledge that we need. So it's like a skin graft. We're taking that, putting it on, and expecting that to heal and then grow. Now, this particular slide talks about how we can retain knowledge. And there are a number of things here that talks about archives and structures and physical structures and things. But one of the things I want to point out to you that we tend to do a lot of because we're humans and then we pay a price for it is individuals. We pay a great deal of attention to the knowledge that individuals have, and we don't do a good job of archiving that. And so when that individual leaves the organization for whatever reason, too much of his or her knowledge goes out the door and doesn't come back. And I'll give you a perfect example. I'm going to clean this example up a little bit because I don't want to be specific. But there was a colleague of mine that I knew, and he lost his position. And I've only seen him once or twice since then. That's been a number of years ago. But he told me that right after he lost his position, the person who replaced him, that person happened to be there at the same time, but sort of took over some of his duties, would call him on the phone and say, "What did you do about this?" And his response was, "It's not my problem." And so that's what I'm saying, is that we have a tendency to see this stored within people. And we don't do a very good job of capturing that when they're physically there, when they're physically with us. And we tend to let that knowledge walk out the door. I'm not talking about expertise here. I'm talking about knowledge. We let that knowledge walk out the door. And not all of it, but a great percent of it. So we need to pay attention to that. And we need to make sure that we're capturing the knowledge that that person has. So when he or she leaves, for whatever reason, we have it and we can continue and don't have to go through this calling somebody on the phone and say, "What did you do about this?" And we said, "That's not my problem." Organizational design. Well, it kind of goes back a little bit of what we talked about in the last chapter. We have to decide what kind of structure is going to work best for us and then implement that structure. And this kind of goes to the next slide. Here we have the organizational design and some things we have to look at. How large are we? What type of operations and information technology we have? Environment? What's our strategy? All those things impact on organizational design. And this down at the bottom talks about something that IBM, the slide, talks about something IBM did. And so that its overall organizational design matches the technical challenges that they have. And that really talks about, without saying this, it talks about being flexible. It talks about being adaptable. Adaptable. I don't know where that word came from. Adaptable. And so those are things that they can do. And last thing here on this slide, it helps them in their competitive environment. This talks about organization design. We know that large firms have a lot of specialization with them. They have to have. It's the nature of the beast. Whereas a small firm, what it does is directly influenced by its core, because it's not large enough to have a diversification of operations. It's only going to have a certain core, and so it's limited by that. But at the same token, it has a little bit, allows them to be a little bit more agile. Simple design, we're going to find this with small companies and perhaps medium-sized companies. They're going to only specialize in one or two ways, and they probably are going to have a combination, at least in my experience, are going to have a combination of some vertical and a lot of horizontal. They simply have to have a lot of horizontal because a small firm really is kind of stultified if it wants to do vertical control, because it isn't going to work. They have to be able to answer customers quickly, and they can't be going back and asking what needs to be done from somebody else. So they may have some, but more than likely they have a lot less than where we find them in larger firms. Operations technology. This is a combination of knowledge and things of that nature, and techniques that help us make what we're making or providing the service that we provide. We know what information technology is. That's a combination of all the things that come under that realm. It's things like in company media, how we communicate. It's information. It's dissemination of that information. Notice the last thing is transforming that information into knowledge. That's the interpretation part that we talked about before. It has to be meaningful. If it's not meaningful, we might as well not have it. And that's one of the things we really have to pay attention to when we get email or text messages or whatever it is. We have to make sense out about what we're getting. And, I talked about the 80-20 rule. I think it was last week or the week before last. So much of what we get does not give us payback. And we really need to focus on the things that give us payback. We can't be spinning our wheels on something that we don't get much bang for our buck or return for our dollar, whatever term you like to use. Now, this is Thompson's view of technology, and I like to talk about what he does here because it's important. Then we also have Woodward's view, which we're going to come up in a second. He classifies this according to the degree of specialization and interdependence among work activities. And he breaks this down into what he calls intensive technology, mediation technology or mediating technology, and long-linked technology. Intensive is uncertainty as to what you're going to do and how you're going to produce your outcomes, and you have to have specialists to help you through this process. Mediating links the people together that need to or want to become interdependent. And then long-linked technology, production methods known as broken down into a number of sequential steps. Now, Woodward takes this just a little bit differently. And by the way, you can see Woodward's view of technology on 409, Thompson's view of technology on page 408. And she talks about small batch production, mass production, and then continuous process technology. Very interesting what she talks about. The small batches, variety of custom products made, mass production, produces one or few products through an assembly line system, and then the continuous process technology, a few products using considerable automation. Adhocracy is a term that has come in. It was coined by Henry Mintzberg, a management guru. And we talked about Mintzberg early on in the course. Notice that it's characterized by very few rules, a great deal of decentralization, shared decision making, horizontal specialization, which certainly complements decentralization. Very few levels of management, which we would expect, and then virtually no formal controls. Now, this type of organizational design is useful when you have tasks that vary considerably and problems are difficult to define and solve. So here, when you think about this, you have many people addressing a number of things where you wouldn't do that in some other manner. So it's not the best of all worlds. Pardon me, not the best of all worlds. And they feel that it is very good at promoting innovation. So you have to look at what you have to determine if, in fact, you're able to use this type of design. Probably does not work well in many large established companies, but likely does work well in a computer-related industry. Well, this particular slide starts out by why IT makes a difference. And I would like to change that just a little bit to say why it's important to have information technology and to have people that understand it and make sure that it's used to its maximum potential. It has a number of things here. It helps with operations, process controls, which we talked about earlier, and then helps people coordinate because it has many different avenues that we can talk about, how you do things, et cetera, et cetera. And it does, or it should, provide a strategic capability. This is this business of getting the information and making sense of it, making it useful. It also helps with things like computer-aided design, and helps with complex decision support systems, and it empowers people by allowing them to expand their jobs, to do more communication, to do more coordination. That is if the tools are set correctly, not to say that they wouldn't be or couldn't be. Virtual organization, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. We know what that is, or we should understand what that is. It talks about a changing constellation of firms, and actually it's you have a sort of a hub here, and the firms pool their resources and their skills, etc., so they can thrive together. It's an interesting concept. I can't tell you that I know any organization that does that, but it is something that's sort of, I suppose, the wave of the future. companies have to be concerned about two types of environments: general environment and the specific environment. The general talks about culture, socio-political, government, educational, etc. And these are things found in the organization's area of operations. The specific comes to things like the owners themselves, suppliers, other type of stakeholders that we talked about before, and the organization has to know these because this is its competition, where the general organization, the general environment is where the company operates, the organization operates. Here's the environment, and there's environmental influences, there's interdependence, there's uncertainty, there's richness, which leads to environmental complexity. So it's everything that makes us up, outside and inside. I think that's the way to look at it. Outside is general, inside specific. Of course, suppliers and government are actually outside, but those are actually people who, in some respect, influence our operations. And so there's the two of them. We talked about this early on, and there's some overlapping here. And an organization needs to know how it does that, how it operates within both of these, and make sure that it's doing what it needs to do. It has to have buy-in from the general environment before it can operate within a specific environment. At least that's my term. Now, notice here what it says. The environment's better. I won't say richer. Environment's better when economic times are good, when people are growing and learning, and when the organization is prospering. Environmental interdependence is the link between the outside environment and the organization's design. Organization may get outsiders, powerful people to help them, and then develop, notice here it says, centralized staff department to handle important external groups. You do this through public relations, if they're large enough, through legislative liaisons and people of that nature. Well, I think it goes without saying that the environment, at least the general environment, is both uncertain and it can be quite volatile. So organization has to be designed to be able to meet both this uncertainty and the volatility. It can't be left to try to figure those things out on their own. Now this talks about what I was talking about a few minutes ago about the global operating environment in which organizations and businesses find themselves today. Go back to the term of co-evolve, which we talked about before. Because we have a complex global environment, we have to be able to navigate through that environment. So we do two ways of co-evolving here. We have to have networks, and those have to be managed, and we have to develop alliances. Now, American companies have to be very careful about alliances because sometimes those things can become can morph into things that become anti-competitive, and the government does not like that. So you have to be careful when you develop these alliances to make sure that they are done according to the law and stay within the rules of law. Inter-firm alliances are just cooperations between organizations. We can have things like joint ventures, and again, those things are sometimes subject to government regulation, so you have to be careful about that. I'm going back to what I just said on the previous slide, but you have to make sure that they do that. And then sometimes when you do have these joint agreements, the firm's headquarters are in different countries, so you have to make sure that you negotiate those type of things. And then notice it's a strategy that's often used by high-tech companies. Now, strategic leadership is something that you expect. This goes on. It's notices it talks about it being a study of quasi-independent units, departments, etc. But we need to have people involved in this strategic leadership because if we don't, then we're going to be someplace where we don't want to be. Here are the challenges to strategic leadership. It has cognitive complexity and behavioral complexity. Now you can see these mentioned on page 417 in the text. Cognitive complexity, excuse me, something degree to which individuals perceive nuances and subtle differences. Cognitive complexity. We're thinking here about the brain and how people can see the differences, the minor differences between things. Whereas behavioral complexity centers on the possession of roles and the ability to selectively apply them. Composition of the top management team can alter choices made in the organization through collective nature, temperament, outlook, and interaction among team members. I think that goes without saying. And then they can have a major influence on things like our shared culture. We've talked about this before, chapter 15, decision making, and an ethical foundation of day-to-day workplace behaviors. Ethics has been embedded in the course throughout as we work these ethics and OB scenarios. Very important to see and to undertake. This is figure 17.1, excuse me, which you can see on page 420 in the text. And it talks here about merging theories, emotional intelligence, and then cognitive complexity flexibility. This model by Bale and Hoiberg shows about these three things: charismatic, transformational vision, leadership, and it shows how these combine to promote both strategic leadership effectiveness and organizational effectiveness. So we think about how these things are intertwined, the emotional theories, behavioral complexity, emotional intelligence complexity, and cognitive complexity flexibility. How these things give us things like absorptive capacity, not easy for me to say, obviously. capacity to change, and then managerial wisdom. Now, let's break this down. Absorptive capacity means I have an ability to take things in and learn from what I'm taking in. Adaptive capacity just seems I can change. I am not rigid, not bound to some particular thing, so I am static in any particular type thing at all. And in managerial wisdom, I think that we all wished we had that, something that we aspire to. Notice what it says here. It's the ability, the ability to perceive variation in the environment, both the general environment and the specific environment. Understand the people that we come in contact with, and then the relationships. So we need to think about those three items and how they believe to do this. The last thing I think I'll mention to you down here at the bottom of the slide when it talks about managerial wisdom. A leader must be able to make or to take the right action at the right moment. That's something that is not easily done, not easily understood. So we have to think about these things, and we have to have the two above those, absorptive capacity and adaptive capacity, before we can get to managerial wisdom. If we don't have those things, we probably won't get where we want to be and where we need to be. Well, we spent the last 36 minutes talking about strategy, technology, and organizational design. That concludes our series of lectures. And I want to thank you for your attendance. I will get this posted tomorrow and provide you information about it. So I thank you for your attention, and good night.